Welcome to the debate. Yesterday, the landscape of computation it shifted under our feet in a way that I don't think the general public is quite grasped yet. Cortical Labs officially launched the CL1. Now, we aren't talking about another incremental jump in GPU architecture or some new transformer model. We are talking about the world's first commercial synthetic biological intelligence. This is a server rack, standard size, fits in a data center, but inside it is not running on silicon wafers. It's running on living human brain cells. They are calling it wetware as a service.
It is certainly a headline that grabs you by the throat. I mean, it sounds like science fiction, but it is sitting there in a lab processing data. The question we have to grapple with, though, is whether this is actually the future of computing or, just a very impressive, very high-maintenance science experiment.
Precisely. And that is the fundamental disagreement we are exploring today. Does the future of general intelligence, true AGI, lie in what you might call biological computationalism, where the physical substrate is the algorithm, potentially harnessing quantum effects we are only just beginning to map? I'm here to argue that it does. I believe that attempting to emulate the mind on dead silicon is a dead end.
And I am here to take the other side. I'm going to argue that silicon-based neuromorphic computing, so chips that mimic the brain's architecture without all the biological mess, combined with decentralized infrastructure, offers the superior, the ethical, and the, frankly, pragmatic path. I think wetware is fascinating, but I seriously question the viability of relying on biology, and I am very skeptical of the whole quantum biological hypothesis in the warm, wet environment of the brain.
It is good to be back in the studio with you. Let's lay out the stakes here. We have spent the last 70 years trying to brute force intelligence through the von Neumann architecture. The standard design where you have a processor here, memory over there, and you're just shuttling data back and forth across a bus. We have hit a wall. We are building data centers that consume the energy of small nations just to train large language models that still hallucinate, that still struggle with basic cause and effect, and ultimately are just predicting the next token. My position is rooted in biological computationalism. The brain doesn't run a program like your laptop runs Excel. In the brain, the physical organization is the computation. The CL1 uses living neurons on high-density multi-electrode arrays. It is dynamic. It rewrites its own hardware on the fly to solve problems. And crucially, it is efficient. The human brain runs on about 20 watts. A dim light bulb. To get anywhere near that complexity with silicon, you are burning megawatts. And I also believe we are seeing evidence, specifically from the 2024 studies on superradiance, that the brain is utilizing quantum processes. True cognition might actually require quantum biological hardware.
I see the same landscape, but I see a completely different path forward. You are right that the von Neumann bottleneck is a problem. Shuttling data back and forth is inefficient. But the answer isn't to retreat into biology and start, growing brains in jars. The answer is to build better architecture that mimics the brain's efficiency without the biological baggage. I'm championing neuromorphic computing in silicon. Look at Intel's Halo Point, based on the Loihi 2 chip. This isn't your standard CPU. This is a system that supports over 1 billion neurons and processes signals 20 times faster than a human brain. And it does that by utilizing sparse firing events to save massive amounts of energy. Or look at the Deep South supercomputer, capable of 220 trillion spikes per second. We can simulate the spiky neural networks of the brain with extreme efficiency using FPGAs and custom silicon. We don't need a life support system to do math. And regarding the infrastructure, the future is deep in decentralized physical infrastructure networks. We don't need to centralize biological vats. We need to distribute the silicon capacity we already have.
I see why you rely on those engineering specs, but I want to push back on this definition of compute and simulation. You mentioned Hollow Point and Deep South. These are incredible feats of engineering, I grant you that. But they are still simulations. They are digital approximations of what a neuron does.
But if the input and the output are mathematically identical,
Does the distinction between simulation and reality actually matter for the user?
It matters because the math isn't identical. That is the core of the biological computationalism argument. You seem to view the brain as a complex wiring diagram. If you just connect enough nodes and simulate the spikes, you get a mind. But a biological brain is a hybrid system. It is not just digital spikes firing on or off. It involves continuous electromagnetic fields, ionic flows, and metabolic constraints that silicon simply ignores. Take the C11. It represents a minimal viable brain approach. In the labs, these cells self-adapt. They learn to play the video game Pong, not because a programmer wrote a line of code saying, if ball goes up, move paddle up. They learned it because of the free energy principle. The cells sought to minimize the unpredictability in their environment. The reward was a predictable signal. The punishment was random noise. They rewired their own physical dendrites and axons to maximize the predictable signal.
That is scale inseparability. You cannot separate the software from the hardware.
That is a compelling narrative, the idea that the wetness and the struggle for survival drives the intelligence. But let's look at this pragmatically. You call it a minimal viable brain. I look at the CL1 and I see a maximum maintenance headache. You are talking about a system that needs precise temperature control, nutrient flushes, waste removal, and protection from infection.
That is the trade-off for genuine adaptability. Biology is high maintenance because it is alive.
But is that a feature or a bug? There is a famous saying in neuromorphic engineering, we don't build planes by growing feathers. Just because nature solved the problem of flight with feathers and muscle doesn't mean that is the efficient engineering solution for carrying cargo across the Atlantic. We built jet engines. Neuromorphic silicon is the jet engine of intelligence. Deep South uses field programmable gate arrays, FPGAs. These are chips that can be rewired electrically almost instantly to match the brain scale of processing. They do this without a filtration system. They do this without the risk of the processor getting a bacterial infection and dying.
But are we building tools, or are we trying to build intelligence? The jet engine is a magnificent tool, but it doesn't know it's flying. It has no internal state of understanding.
We are building useful compute. That is the goal of the industry. Look at the Spinnaker project and the commercial spin-off SpinCloud. They are simulating billions of neurons effectively. They are handling the connectivity and the spiking neural networks where data is only sent when a spike happens, just like a neuron firing. But they offer reliability. If a node fails in a decentralized network like Grass or on a silicon grid, another node takes over instantly. It's redundant. If your biological culture in the CL1 rack gets contaminated or suffers a metabolic crash, you lose the mind. You lose the training. The overhead of the life support system for the CL1 negates the energy efficiency gains of the neurons themselves.
I'm not convinced by that line of reasoning because it focuses purely on the operational costs and ignores the qualitative difference in processing power. Even the best neuromorphic chips are orders of magnitude less efficient than biology at learning from sparse data. A child sees a cat once, maybe twice, and knows what a cat is. An LLM or a neuromorphic system needs to see 1,000,000 cats. The CL1 is bridging that gap. It's not just about power bills. It's about the fundamental mechanism of one-shot learning which biology excels at.
I would argue that gap is closing faster than you think. But let's shift gears, because I know where you want to take this. You mentioned quantum biological effects in your opening.
I did. And this is where the divergence between our views becomes sharpest. If the orchestrated objective reduction theory, OR, is correct, then consciousness, and by extension, high-level general intelligence, it arises from quantum state reductions in microtubules. These are the structural skeletons inside our neurons.
This is the Penrose and Hameroff hypothesis.
Correct. For years, critics like yourself said the brain is too warm, wet, and noisy to sustain quantum coherence. You argued that thermal noise would destroy any quantum state before it could do anything useful.
Which is a valid critique based on standard physics. Quantum states usually require near absolute zero temperatures.
That was the conventional wisdom. But look at the 2024 study on ultraviolet superradiance in tryptophan networks. This was a smoking gun. It showed that biological structures can support quantum optical effects, even in thermal conditions. The tryptophan networks inside the cells act like fiber optics, shielding the quantum state, and it gets more compelling. We have experimental results showing that anesthetics, specifically things like halothane, impair these quantum channels. They dampen delayed luminescence. When you take away the quantum activity, consciousness turns off. The computer is still on, the brain is still firing electrically, but the mind is gone. This links quantum physics directly to consciousness. If silicon cannot support these quantum state reductions because it lacks that microtubule structure, then silicon AI will always be a zombie. It might act like it understands, but the lights are off inside.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that. Let me tell you why. You are building a castle on a foundation of sand. The super radiance study is interesting. I've read it, but it is far from conclusive proof of consciousness. The critique of that theory is substantial and, in my opinion, devastating. You are ignoring the environment these microtubules live in. Critics have pointed out that endogenous ferritin iron storage proteins are everywhere in these cells. Ferritin absorbs UV photons. It quenches that superradiance. So even if the tryptophan networks could transmit a quantum signal, the ferritin would drown it out immediately. It's like trying to whisper across a rock concert. The signal-to-noise ratio is impossible.
But the presence of ferritin is variable, and the network's topology might...
But it breaks the proposed mechanism. And regarding the anesthetic studies, those were often performed in artificial conditions that ignored the complex protein environment of a real brain. You cannot cherry-pick the lab results that fit the theory. But more importantly, why do we need magic to explain intelligence? We have benchmarks. We have the MMLU, the Massive Multitask Language Understanding Test. We have the ARC benchmark for abstract reasoning. Silicon models like GPT-4 and Claude are achieving expert-level reasoning. They are passing bar exams. They are doing complex math. They are deriving code. They are doing this without quantum microtubules. They are doing it with math and silicon. If it looks like a duck, quacks like a duck, and passes the medical boards like a duck, why do you insist it needs a quantum soul?
Because passing a test is not understanding. A calculator can beat me at math, but it doesn't know what a number is. It has no semantic grounding. If we want AGI, general intelligence that can navigate the world, innovate, and relate to us, it needs to share our reality. And our reality seems to be rooted in quantum biology.
I come at it from a different way. I think understanding is an emergent property of complexity. You don't need a specific biological substrate to get there, you just need the right architecture. And frankly, rely on biology introduces ethical and scalability nightmares that silicon avoids.
Let's talk about that scalability then. You seem to think biology is hard to scale, but I look at the energy consumption of silicon, and I see a wall. The energy crisis of AI is real. We are projecting data centers that demand gigawatts of power. We're keeping coal plants open just to run chatbots. The CL1 rack runs on 850 to 1,000 watts for a massive amount of cognitive potential. That is a fraction of what an NVIDIA H100 cluster consumes.
I agree that the energy consumption of centralized AI is a problem. But the solution isn't wetware, it's DePIN. Decentralized Physical Infrastructure Networks. Look at what is happening with projects like GRASS. They have 2 million users monetizing their unused internet bandwidth for AI data collection. Look at Render. It's a $1.8 billion market cap project distributing GPU rendering. Ale.net is aggregating decentralized GPUs for compute. This distributes the load across a global network rather than concentrating it in a massive, energy-sucking data center. It utilizes the latent capacity we already have in our gaming PCs and idle servers. That is how you solve the energy crisis, not by growing brains, but by stopping the waste of the silicon we've already built.
That is an interesting point, though I would frame it differently. DePIN is excellent for distribution, yes, I am a fan of the model, but ultimately, you're still distributing inefficient compute. You are just spreading the heat generation across millions of homes instead of one building. The fundamental unit of compute, the GPU, is still thousands of times less efficient than a neuron.
Perhaps for now, but let's look at the other side of the coin, ethics. You mentioned earlier that the CLL1 is useful for things like drug discovery.
Absolutely. One of the primary drivers for organoid intelligence, or OI, is biomedical utility. We have been trying to cure Alzheimer's and epilepsy using mouse models that fail to capture human brain nuance. The CLL1 allows us to test therapeutics on actual human neural networks. A chip cannot tell you if a drug will cause neural toxicity. That is an ethical utility that silicon cannot match.
I completely agree with you on the bioethical application. Using tissue to test drugs for humans is deeply logical and necessary. But using tissue as a computer to run my email server or generate video, that is where I draw the line. If the CL1 learns, if it adapts, if it operates on this free energy principle to minimize surprise, at what point are we enslaving a rudimentary consciousness? If you are right and there are quantum effects leading to some form of experience, aren't you building a digital sweatshop of living minds? You can't have it both ways. You can't say it's conscious enough to be better than silicon, but it's not conscious enough to have rights.
That is a heavy accusation, but one that the field is taking very seriously. The current consensus among bioethicists and the creators of CL1 is that these organoids, while active, lack the sensory input, the limbic system, and the complex architecture required for sentient experience or suffering. They are processing units. But I would turn the table on you. You want to control silicon AI. You want to ensure safety. How do you control a superintelligence that thinks 1,000,000 times faster than you and has no biological tether to mortality?
We have the tools for that. We don't need biological control, we need digital identity. We should be focusing on controlling silicon AI using verifiable credentials and decentralized identifiers. We need to know what an agent is and who controls it. We are moving from federated identity, logging in with Google, to self-sovereign identity. We can bind an AI's actions to a cryptographic identity. We can revoke its credentials if it misbehaves. We have mathematical control. With your biological system, you are dealing with a black box that might decide it doesn't want to work today, or worse, develops a survival instinct we didn't program because it is literally alive.
I see why you think that. But mathematical control of a superintelligence is a fantasy. If we build AGI on silicon, it will likely be alien to us. Its thought processes will be fundamentally different. Biological intelligence, even synthetic biological intelligence, shares our substrate. It shares our metabolic constraints. It shares our vulnerability. That makes it inherently more aligned with human existence than a cold silicon logic that scales indefinitely. A biological system understands what it means to need energy, to need to survive.
Or it makes it more unpredictable. Biology mutates. Silicon is deterministic. We can audit the code, we can audit the weights, we can audit the credentials.
You can audit the weights of a neural network, but you still cannot fully understand the emergent behavior. We are seeing emergence in LLMs right now that we didn't predict. Capabilities appearing that weren't in the training set.
True, but that emergence is happening on hardware we built, running on physics we understand completely. The emergence in your model relies on quantum biological theories that are still heavily contested. You are betting the future of intelligence on a maybe regarding microtubules. I am betting it on the proven trajectory of neuromorphic engineering and decentralized networks.
I'm not convinced that trajectory is as proven as you think. Moore's law is dead. We are shrinking transistors to the point where quantum tunneling is becoming a nuisance, causing errors. We have to change the paradigm. The CL1 is that shift. It is the convergence of neuroscience and AI. It bridges the gap between processing and understanding, because the processing is the life process.
Yet I maintain that neuromorphic computing projects like Lohi and Spinnaker, combined with the power of DeSci, or decentralized science, is the robust path. We can have the architecture of the brain without the fragility of the body. The warm, wet nature of biology is a bug for a computer. We want our computers to work in the desert, in space, in a server room. We don't want them to need a nutrient flush every few hours.
Yet biology is the only existence proof of general intelligence we have in the entire universe. Every single example of real intelligence we have ever met runs on wetware.
For now. But we used to think only birds could fly. Then we built rockets.
And now we are realizing that maybe the bird knew something about aerodynamics and efficiency that the rocket didn't. We seem to have reached the edge of our time. It is clear that the era of the von Neumann architecture is ending. Whether it is replaced by living cells in a rack or neuromorphic chips in a decentralized grid, the separation of memory and CPU is over.
On that, we agree. The future is parallel, it is event-driven, and it is massively interconnected. The question is whether we build those connections out of silicon and light or out of carbon and life.
Are we building better tools, or are we birthing new forms of life? The CL1 suggests the latter, and I think that is a beautiful, terrifying frontier.
And that is exactly what worries me. I prefer my tools to remain tools.
As always, we do not declare a winner here. It is up to you, the listener, to decide where the true substrate of intelligence lies. Thank you for listening to The Debate.
Goodbye.